Hi, my name is Elizabeth Ferris, and I will be leading you through this next session, Finding Your Inner Editor. I'm really glad that you all can be here with me in this sort of different format. I will be coming to you guys live after this presentation. If you have any questions or anything you want to talk about, we'll leave plenty of time for a really good, thorough Q&A. So if any questions come up for you as we're going through this presentation together, just jot them down, make a note of them, and I'd be happy to talk to y'all about them later. I know I've been introduced a bit at this point, but I just wanted to talk a little more specifically about my background as an editor. So I started out editing many years ago for Vanderbilt University Press. I edited mostly scholarly books on topics relating to world history and sociology, but my passion was really always in the more kind of creative arts, creative writing, and so gradually I began to take on some work as a freelance editor, doing more developmental type editing with memoirists and eventually some novelists, and I continue to do that today, and I'm also the editor of Life in 10 Minutes Press, based out of Richmond, Virginia, a small press specializing in first-person narratives. And I also work with SFK Multimedia out of Georgia on their Blissful Beings imprint, working specifically with memoir writers. And so this talk will really be focused on narrative prose, so both fiction and nonfiction, though I think maybe there would be something for poets to get out of it as well. But really my area of expertise is in narrative prose, so we're gonna focus our conversation there today. I am going to do a split screen or a share screen for our talk. I actually have a slide presentation put together. There's a lot of information that I want to go over with you all today, and I find having it typed up and on the screen is great for me to sort of keep track and keep organized of what I want to talk to you all about. And I think it'll be great for you guys too, so that you can actually see the examples that I give, see some of the bullet points, see some of the quotes. Feel free to do a screen grab, a photograph of anything that you want to keep the material, or pause this video after, it'll be up on the cloud afterwards, to sort of jot down any notes. So without further ado, I'm gonna get into our talk. So just one moment while I bring up our slideshow. All right, so the topic of this talk is going to be finding your editor self. So finding your editor self. This particular language comes from Mary Carr's wonderful book on editing for memoir, or constructing memoir, in which she says every writer needs two selves, the generative self and the editor self. So today in this particular presentation, we're really going to be getting in touch with that generative self. So I love this quote from George Saunders. He says, "What does the writer do? She tweaks that which she has already done." And this quote from Toni Morrison, it's a bit lengthy, but I like looking at it fully. So in it she says, "I don't mind writing badly for a couple of days because I know I can fix it and fix it again and again and again, and it will be better. That's the thrill of a lifetime for me. If I can just get done with that first phase and then have infinite time to fix it and change it. I rewrite a lot over and over again so that it looks like I never did. I try to make it look like I never touched it, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of sweat." This is a cartoon that I am always tickled by, from Pearls Before Swine by Stephen Pattis. So Pig says, "Hey Goat, where were you last weekend?" And Goat says, "I went to a writer's retreat." And this is sort of Pig's imagination of all these writers running away, retreating from writing because it's too hard, which I think we can all feel like sometimes. And part of what I want to focus on today is really talking about how we can look at editing a little bit differently, so it doesn't feel so much like we're editing to root out our flaws or prove to us ourselves what lousy writers we are. But we can actually see it as sort of like Toni Morrison alludes to in her quote, or says in her quote, as really really a process of a very natural, normal process that we're free to work and rework again and again. You know, I think that as writers, we sometimes look at ourselves as if we we forget to compare ourselves to other types of artists. So, you know, the songwriter doesn't just write a song once through and has it the way she wants it to be, or a sculptor doesn't just make a few strokes, he comes back again and again, and the oil painter does the same thing. But for some reason, as writers, I think we feel like if we don't get it down the right way the first time, that we've somehow failed, or we suspect that everyone else has these really great first drafts, and it's just us with these kind of lousy seeming first drafts. So the word that I like to look at or keep in mind, even though this is a talk about editing, I actually prefer the synonym to revise. So whereas editing can feel like editing ourselves, can feel like, looking for what we're doing wrong, stopping ourselves, tearing up the page, revise is actually a much gentler word. And it comes way back from Latin. I put the etymology up here. I love etymologies. I'm always looking them up for different words. It can be really helpful. And I think in this case, it really is. So to revise simply means to look again. And so I want us to kind of put that in the back of our head, that that's what we're doing today. We are simply looking again at the work that we've done. So I always find it helpful to know where a presentation is going. We kind of have a little bit of a roadmap of what to expect. And so I have more or less 4 topics that we're going to focus on in our time together today. And, you know, with this sort of theme that that editing is, or revising is looking again, you know, what I often feel like I'm doing as an editor is less sort of being a drill sergeant or the person with all the answers, but I'm trying to sort of accompany a writer in this process of looking at their work again. And that way I feel a bit more like a teacher, or a bit more like counsel. And, you know, what my experience is that, you know, as an editor, I've looked at a lot of books. And so you start to kind of see patterns of what to look out for as you're revisiting works. And I think you also know that feeling of kind of despair or hopelessness that sometimes arises at various points in the process of revising, it passes, right? It always passes. And I think, you know, for me, every time, even if a particular book is sort of flummoxing me, I don't exactly know, I can sense that something needs to change, that it's not quite where it needs to be, but I don't know how to go about it, right? And I sort of despair, and I think, oh God, I gotta, like, you know, tell this publishing company or tell this author that I'm not the right person for this book, and it always passes, right? And so I think that's another sort of benefit of being an editor, and something that we can do, attitude that we can adopt when we are sort of cultivating this editor self, which is to remember that this sort of this kind of feeling of despair, or like we don't know what to do, it will pass if we just keep looking and looking again at our work. So what I did for this presentation, because it's about looking again at our work, I could look at almost any topic, right? Any aspect of craft could be part of this talk, because editing is simply going back into the writing and looking how we might write it differently, or adjust the writing. And so any element of craft can really apply to this process of editing. But I picked out three that I feel like I come back to time and time again with folks. And so the first topic that we'll cover is this concept of experiential writing. I'll get into that in just a moment, exactly what I mean by that. The second topic is looking at the beginnings of pieces, right? Are we beginning in the right place? And then we're going to look a bit at scene and dialogue from an editor's perspective, from a perspective of once the scene's down on the page, how can we think about going back in? What questions can we ask to know if we're getting the most out of our scenes? And then finally, I think one of the sources that we all have access to, regardless of whether or not we're working with an editor or a writing group, is our family and friends, to look at our drafts. And I think that that can actually, even if your family and friends don't have specific training in editing, I think that they can be wonderful resources for getting feedback on what you're working on. But I think that we have to approach it correctly. I think there are some ways that we can approach getting feedback from family and friends that really just doesn't give us anything that we can use. And then there are other ways that we can approach it that even if our particular family member or friend doesn't have any training whatsoever in editing or giving feedback or isn't a writer themselves, I think there are some ways we can approach it where we can still get really good, useful feedback from them. All right, so what is experiential writing? So in a nutshell, information tells the reader something we want them to know, but experience puts them there. It's a little bit akin to this edict that we hear, show, don't tell. But I actually want to think about it as something separately. I think the show, don't tell edict is a little more complicated than we make it. In fact, I think often with my writers that I'm working with, I'm trying to get them to show and tell, and to know when to do each. But I like this division, this kind of parallel division or analogous decision between experiential writing and informational writing. I find this a really sort of fruitful and useful distinction to keep in mind. So in our worlds, growing up as writers, being asked to write in school or being asked to write on the job, often what we're doing is we're doing informational writing, right? We have some idea or some process in mind, and we want to communicate that to the reader. We want to take the idea, this sort of semantic concept, out of our head and give it in the most direct way to our reader, right? So classic informational writing would be like a recipe, or the instructions for setting up your IKEA bookshelf, right? Just the facts, ma'am. And what we're doing, I think, in creative writing, I think if we want to kind of overstate it and say that what's the thing that's different about creative writing versus this informational writing, because informational writing can be quite engaging if it's written by someone with a real sense of humor and a sense of voice. So how might that be different, though, from creative writing? And I think we can say that creative writing is experiential. It's about inviting our readers to inhabit the bodies and spirits and souls and consciousnesses of other beings, to be there. And so while information might sound something like Sarah washed her face, I wanted to communicate to my reader that Sarah came home and she washed her face. Well, that's great, but how might I rework this to have it be more of an experience, have it be more something that instead of the reader receiving some information about Sarah, knowing what Sarah is up to, the reader actually feels in the room with Sarah and begins to really align themselves with Sarah. And so here's an example of how I would find this sentence in my work or someone else's work and rework it to be more of an experience. Sarah stood over the sink, the hot water spilling from the tap, scrubbing the day's grime from her cheeks. So suddenly that information, that informational nugget, that fact is relayed to us in a way that invites us to participate in the experience with Sarah. So why does it matter? Why does experiential writing matter? Well, I love this quote from Mary Karr, and this is again from her book, The Art of Memoir. She's speaking specifically to memoir writers, and that's particularly clear in the sort of the first sentence. But I think beyond the first sentence, what we have here applies to fiction writers just as equally. So Mary Karr says, nobody buys a memoir except maybe by those ubiquitous celebrities to master the cold data of someone's life. Some writers make such great sentences that they fascinate even while dispensing facts. But mostly, information is the good writer's nemesis. It yanks the reader out of scenes, away from drama and lived experience, where the reader can watch external events and interpret them on his own. And so I guess for any ubiquitous celebrities in the audience, you can just, tune out now. But for the rest of us, I think there's a really important lesson here. And I think it has to do with character and character development, or maybe not quite character development, maybe that's not quite the right word, but character, the relationship between the reader and the character. Sometimes we make this artificial division, I think, between character-based stories and plot-driven stories. But I would argue that while certainly some writers and some readers are more interested in character and some are more interested in plot, that division is a somewhat false one, because what is plot except for what happens to characters? Right? And if we care about a character, we inherently care about what comes next in the book, right? Because we care about what's going to happen to them. And if we don't care about a character, the plot starts to have to do a tremendous amount of work to have us be invested at all. And so I think part of what experiential writing is doing is it's really giving us that relationship with the character. And it's one of the number one things that I'm looking out for as an editor, is this writing experiential. So I've given you a bit of a definition, but what I want to go to next is just a quick look at how we might revise for experience. There are many ways we can go about doing this, and honestly, I think one of the best ways to learn how to revise for it is simply to read with an eye toward it. Right? What books do you love? Were you riveted by? And where can you go in and see how the author is creating this experience? How even though you do have a sense of information, in the sense that you could summarize for someone else what the book was about, that really wouldn't hold a candle to what it actually felt like to read a book. I mean, have you ever had that experience, right? You read this book, you're up all night, oh my God, I'm so invested, and then someone says, well, what was it about? And you summarize it and you think, wow, but it was so much more, right? That's the experience. And so here are some ways that we do that, or some ways that as an editor I'm offering to writers to do it. One is to substitute in the specific. So the specific is that, your character is driving a red Mustang instead of just a car, right? Or a beat up brown Pinto with the bumper hanging off. But these are two very different images, right, that come to mind. They suggest different things about the characters. And they give us something to picture. They give us something to participate with. Similarly, a dachshund, someone walking a dachshund is different than someone walking a Great Dane. It puts a totally different picture in our head, and one that we can't access at all if all the writer has given us is dog. The second thing is a focus on the sensory, and by this I mean quite literally the five senses, the embodied experience of the character. It sometimes gets called carnal writing as well. What can that character see, taste, touch, hear, and feel physically feel on the skin, right? And I love this quote by the memoirist and novelist. She has plenty of novels as well, Dani Shapiro, and she says that for us to access a character's essential humanness, we must have access to their body. And so, you know, I'm always looking for ways to give, to have writers give access to their characters' bodies. Thirdly, we want to exploit the power of concrete images. This is quite related to the first two, to sensory and specific, in that you know, it's that brown Pinto with the bumper hanging off. You know, it's the candy striper uniform that the volunteer in the hospital is wearing. It's the run in, the lady next to you on the train's tights. It's anything that is concrete enough to flash an image in the reader's head, that is participation, right? Suddenly I'm seeing in my head what the character is seeing in his or her or their head. And finally, you know, editing for verbs. This is I think verbs are the literal workhorses, right? They're the thing that get our characters across the room, or get them doing something, get them shouting or grimacing or exploding with joy. And yet, I find that in our drafting process, we're really often just reaching for the most obvious verb, right? So we all know to kind of try to edit for or be mindful of when we use to be verbs, but I think it goes beyond that, right? There's a really big difference between someone who walks into a, you know, if we say walks into a room, that's, you know, something, but on either side of that, there's a big difference between someone who creeps into a room or who saunters into a room. And so can we go back in and look for our verbs? And they don't have to, it's not necessarily about, I want to emphasize, it's not necessarily about having every verb really pop or draw attention to itself, but knowing those moments when we want the verb to pop or we want the verb to draw attention to itself. You know, some editors will say to never use an adverb. Well, I love a great adverb, but I think that the heart of that message is that if you have chosen the particular enough verb, then it doesn't need to be modified by anything. So if you find yourself relying on a lot of adverbs, that's a pretty good indication that it's time to look at the verbs that you're choosing a little more deeply. There's a very short story that's pretty broadly anthologized. It's Raymond Carver's short story, Popular Mechanics. And if you're interested in this prompting about editing for verbs, I really invite you to look at that pull up that short story. You can find it online, most likely. If not, you know, many anthologies have it. And underline every verb that he uses. It's a very sort of minimalist story that doesn't tell us much about what the characters are thinking or feeling. We're really not on the inside of them at all. And yet we have a very strong idea of what this story feels like, what it would feel like to be there. And that really comes from just some amazing verb choices that he makes. So this is an example actually from something that's my own work. And I want to show you how something was in the first draft and then how I changed it. And you'll see it doesn't actually get that much longer. But I think that it puts into play some of these things that we talked about on the previous slide. So in the first draft, so the context is that, the context is maybe not that important, but Sylvia, this character, has gotten a compliment from Eve that her art reminds her, that Sylvia's art reminds Eve of these two particular painters that Sylvia hasn't heard of. And so she goes to look at for examples of these people's work in an art book. So the story takes place in 1968, so there's no like pulling up the smartphone and Googling it. So she actually goes to look in an art book. So this is a first person plural narrator, a we narrator commenting on this. In front of us, Sylvia took Eve's compliment coolly, but later in the day room, she looked through the art books on the shelf to see if she could find images matching either name. So it's like fine, just not, I don't think it's, you know, bad or anything. It gets the point across. But I just need some small tweaks in revision to make it feel just a bit more intimate, a bit more something that we could picture and participate with. And just something that we could just feel a little bit closer to Sylvia in the moment of. So in front of us, Sylvia took Eve's compliment coolly, but later, alone in the day room, she searched the handful of dusty art books on the shelf, fingering through the waxy pages for images matching either name. And so the first big, I don't know, small edit that I made was I chose to emphasize that Sylvia was alone in the day room. It was a simple addition, and in my head, in fact, I kind of pictured her alone in the day room, but I just didn't think to put that down. But I think it sets the mood and it sets the atmosphere, so I added that in. The next thing that I changed is I changed looked through to searched, right? That looked is kind of a blank way to participate with something, but searching suggests some more urgency. As a verb change that I made. And then I took through the art books on the shelf and I just particularized them just a little bit. I made them a little bit more specific so that the reader could participate with and begin to picture these. The handful of dusty art books on the shelf. And then I added another verb, a little bit longer clause that was meant to bring in the five senses, to align us with Sylvia as she's doing this search, to align us with her body. So she's fingering through the waxy pages. And so I think you can see that it's not necessarily about adding a tremendous amount more language, but being just a little bit more thoughtful or more intentional with our language. We can only be so thoughtful and so intentional on a first draft, right? That's completely normal. You know, otherwise we find ourselves getting marred down in these little details and not moving ahead with the story, and that doesn't work for me as a writer. I need to keep moving, but then kind of come back, relook at, and see what I can do. All right, I'm just going to do a quick time check. Okay. Moving forward, just a quick note for people who are writing in the first person. So this can include, of course, memoirists and essayists, but also writers of first-person fiction. So first-person fiction, in a first-person narration, we are telling a story from inside a consciousness out into the world. It's an inside-out telling. And we honor that by having the speaker tell us how they feel about and are making sense of what is going on around them. So a first-person narrator, unless there's a reason not to have them be generous with their thoughts and interpretations, I think we want them to be generous. And often what I'm having writers do in first-person narration is, whether it's memoir or first-person fiction, is I'm saying, tell us how she's feeling here. Tell us what they're thinking about here. How are they responding to this? It might seem obvious, but and the reader might be able to sluice it out, but as a reader, I'm feeling like, why isn't this character relating to me? Why isn't this character telling me what's going on? And again, there might be reasons why you would want to have a character who plays their card, a first-person narrator who plays their card close to their chest. But that's a definite stance, and unless you're taking that stance deliberately, we want some aspect of real telling. A really simple thing to do when revising first-person narration is just to look for any places that the narration is outside in and replace it with inside out. So my cheeks turned red. That's something that a character on the outside can see. But I think if we're going to replace it for first-person narration, we can say, I felt myself blush. That's much closer to how we're experiencing it as the person who's blushing. And this applies, I think, to many close third-person narrations as well. So those third-person narrations where we may be using he or she or they, but we feel tremendously close to the point of view character, as if we are almost within their body. So moving on to beginnings, here are some things that I'm checking out in a beginning of a piece. And this can be something short, like an essay or a short story. but it can be something much longer, like a novel or a memoir. So here's what my checklist for what I want a good beginning to do as an editor. I want it to invite us into the mind and body of a particular speaker or character or set of characters in a particular moment in time. So this sort of goes back to the experiential, right? I want to be invited in right away to a consciousness, and I want it to be rooted in space and time in a way that I can begin making sense of, so that this world can start to spring up around me. Good beginnings are specific and sensory. If I can impart one piece of wisdom from this entire presentation, it would be that it is specificity, not generality, that makes for universality. I resisted this for so long in my own writing. Oh no, I'm not going to name that town. It could be any town. I'm not going to, give that character a specific profession, because it could be every man. And now there are certainly works that deliberately use that. But for me, it was the wrong choice. For me, I was forgetting or not yet realizing that what we relate to, what feels universal about writing, is the deep emotions it brings up, and the real human being that it conjures on the page. And for that, we need specifics. A good beginning gives us a glimpse about who the narrator is and how they're going to narrate their story. And a good beginning establishes what is at stake. That is, they give some sense of the main conflict, desire, mystery, and/or specific journey that is to come. So that by the end of the first chapter, we generally have some idea of what the main character wants. So this is Kurt Vonnegut. Every character should want something, even if it's only a glass of water. So here are some beginnings. I'm going to share with you two beginnings that I think are quite excellent. The first is from Cheryl Strayed's essay published in The Sun magazine called Love of My Life. Cheryl Strayed is best known for Wild, sort of a runaway success of a memoir. This is an essay that she published about her mother's death and her multiple affairs inside of her marriage many years before Wild came out. So she writes, this is the beginning. This is, the title, and now it starts. The first time I cheated on my husband, my mother had been dead exactly 1 week. I was in a cafe in Minneapolis watching a man. He watched me back. He was slightly pudgy with jet black hair and skin so white it looked as if he had powdered it on. He stood and walked to my table and sat down without asking. He wanted to know if I had a cat. I folded my hands on the table, steadying myself. I was shaking, nervous at what I would do. I was raw, fragile, vicious with grief. I would do anything. Yes, I said. So what I think is so brilliant about this opening is that it establishes the stakes in the very first sentence. And then from there, it gives us this very specific scene, right? We could say, why does it matter that the man was slightly pudgy with jet black hair and skin so white that it looked as if it powdered it on? It matters because it feels like something. That suddenly we see that man, suddenly we see him through the eyes of this young, sort of grief, distraught woman. We see him when he stood and walked to her table and sat down without asking. And look in this second half how generous Cheryl Strayed is. Now, we might be able to interpret her, those of us who are kind of sensitive, which most writers are, could maybe interpret how she's feeling, but she gives it to us anyway, and I think that's really important. She says, I folded my hands on the table. And why? Because I was steadying myself. I was shaking, nervous with what I would do. I was raw, fragile, vicious with grief. I would do anything. Look how important, how much we get that we wouldn't have gotten if she simply said, I folded my hands on the table. Yes, I said, right? We could justify to ourselves as writers, oh, we don't need to give that. I'm being subtle, of course. Of course, if she's folding her hands on the table and she sees this man this way, these are the emotions she's gonna feel. And yet my job as an editor is to poke for a little bit more, right? To say, no, we come to the page to know a reader's know a writer's consciousness, know a character's consciousness. So be generous unless there's some reason not to. So the second example that I have is from a fabulous book. Many of you may have read it. It's Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad. It won the National Book Award when it came out a few years ago. I think it may have also won the Pulitzer Prize. But it's a retelling, a reimagining of the Underground Railroad. I'm going to apologize just because it's a little bit blurred on my screen, so I'm going to have to skip a little bit over a sentence, but I'll do my best to read it exactly as it appears. The first time Caesar approached Cora about running north, she said no. This was her grandmother talking. Her grandmother had never seen the ocean until that bright afternoon in the port of Ouida and the dazzled water after her time in the fort's dungeon. The dungeon stored them until the ships arrived. Dahomean raiders kidnapped the men first, then returned to her village the next moon for the women and the children, marching them in chains to the sea, 2 by 2. As she stared into the black doorway, Ajari thought she would be reunited with her father down there in the dark. The survivors from her village told her that when her father couldn't keep the pace of the long march, the slavers stove his head in and left his body on the trail. Her mother had died years before. And then there's quite a bit of text. This is a multi-page introduction, so I'm skipping over that to bring us to the final paragraphs. To escape the boundary of the plantation was to escape the fundamental principles of your existence. Impossible. It was her grandmother talking that Sunday evening when Caesar approached Cora about the Underground Railroad, and she said no. 3 weeks later, she said yes. This time, it was her mother talking. I mean, you just like gotta turn the page after that, right? But I think we see a lot of the same things. Now, in this case, we don't necessarily have that built-out scene the way that Cheryl Strayed does. This is a novel. It's starting a bit slower in the sense of, or a bit pulled back, but we get beautiful evocations of sensory experiences, the dark dungeon, the dazzling water, just heartbreaking evocative verbs like the slaveholders who stove his head in. We get a real sense too of what the character wants. And we get a sense as well, I think, of how this narrator is going to tell this story. So in the Cheryl Strayed, I didn't mention this, but we get a real sense from that first sentence. This is a woman who's going to pull no punches and make no excuses. I mean, she tells us in the first sentence she's cheating on her husband. This is a huge taboo. And I think in this case, we get a real sense of this third person narrator who's going to be able to both sort of stand back and look at the perspective of history, but also sort of zoom in to this intimate character, Cora, who is in fact going to be our main character. So I want to talk just really briefly about some common enemies of effective beginnings. But first, I just want a little kind of morale reminder from Anne Lamott, who says, if you write something and it doesn't work, it doesn't mean you are a morally inferior person. It just means you need to take it out and try again. I have a lot of erasers, and I also hit the delete button a lot. So some common enemies of effective beginnings, starting too early, which is, warming up on the page. We all do it. Most likely where we've begun our novel or our story is not where the ultimate beginning is. We often need to write ourselves into the situation a bit. Trying to fit in too much backstory. We want a certain amount of backstory, but backstory really weighs the narrative down. It also gives the reader a lot that they have to keep track of before they might be feeling fully comfortable in the world. So what I invite us to do instead is to focus on establishing a voice and a sense of character early on, more than a complete backstory, and parcel the backstory out. And along this line is introducing too many characters and or action lines early on. Again, part of what a beginning is doing is it's really making sure the reader feels oriented in the world, feels oriented in the voice, and feels oriented in sort of the thrust of desire in this story. And then finally, don't save your good stuff for chapter 2. I've heard this before from writers who will say, I shouldn't even say I've heard it before from writers, I've said it myself. The first chapter is a little bit slow, but the readers are going to get really invested in chapter 2. Your readers might not read chapter 2. So finally, I'm going to move through this a little quickly. I see that my time is sort of evaporating. But the final thing I want to talk about is tightening up scenes and dialogue. And these are two quotes actually from film directors. I find film just a really fascinating parallel with narrative writing, and just a lot to learn about. You can learn a lot from films, especially in how they handle scenes and dialogues and how they cut between scenes. So Alfred Hitchcock says, drama is life with all the dull parts cut out. And then William Goldman says, you always attack a movie scene as late as you possibly can. You always come into the scene at the last possible moment. Get on. The camera is relentless. It makes you keep running. So one short story that I just absolutely recommend for how it handles moving through time and moving between scenes is Jhumpa Lahiri's The Third and Final Continent. So this comes about midway through the story. It's a man, he is recently immigrated, first he immigrates from India to London, he's Bengali, and then he immigrates from London to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this is the first, he rents this room with this woman who's 103 years old, and he's in his 20s. And it's 1969, the first man has just landed on the moon, and Mrs. Croft is this woman's name. And you can see kind of at this lead-in, which is worth reading, that he begins Friday morning when my first week's rent was due. I went to the piano in the parlor to place my money on the ledge. So right away, he's not saying Friday morning, I got up, I made my scrambled eggs, I brushed my teeth. He just gets us right to what he wants. Jhumpa Lahiri gets us right where she wants us to go. This place where her character places the money on the ledge. There's a moment that happens in this paragraph where he decides, I'm not going to just set it down, I'm actually going to place it in her hand. And so he does that. And so he says, when I approached the bench, she peered up at me and demanded, what a great verb, right? What is your business? The rent, madame. On the ledge above the piano keys, exclamation mark. This character always speaks, this older woman always speaks with exclamation marks. I have it here. I extended the envelope toward her, but her fingers, folded together in her lap, did not budge. I bowed slightly and lowered the envelope so that it hovered just above her hands. After a moment, she accepted it and nodded her head. And then he's out of the scene. That night when I came home, she did not slap the bench, but out of habit, I sat beside her as usual. She asked me if I had checked the lock, but she mentioned nothing about the flag on the moon. Instead, she said, it was very kind of you. I beg your pardon, madame? Very kind of you. She was still holding the envelope in her hands. And then the scene is out, it's done, it's told us everything that we needed. And we're left with this bit of resonance because we've seen the scene come to its full conclusion, but it hasn't overstayed its welcome. So here are some questions that I like to ask my writers or writers I'm working with. I hate when editors say my writers, so I'm gonna not use that cliche. Just some questions that we can ask to tighten up our scenes and dialogue. Can you enter the scene later? Can you get out earlier, right? Come in late, exit early. Questions to ask about dialogue. Does it characterize the speaking characters and the relationships between them? Does it move the story forward and or elevate the stakes or tension? And does it offer necessary background or context in a character's own voice, not the author's? So dialogue doesn't have to do all of these things, but most likely it should be doing one of these things. And if it's not, we want to think about maybe cutting it. And this is a more kind of, using something other than dialogue for it. So this is something else that I think is really important. It's a little bit more of a step back when it comes to looking at scenes and dialogue. But what is the mission of a particular scene and or a chapter? That is, what is it trying to accomplish that hasn't been accomplished yet in the book or the story? We don't want to replay things like Groundhog Day, right? And so this is something very cruel that I have done with writers before, but ultimately it's very successful. It's been very successful, which is I actually have them write kind of a mission statement for each chapter, or if the chapters are very long and very few, then I would have them write for a mission statement for each particular scene. What is that scene accomplishing? Or in the case of a short story or an essay, I would have them, what is it accomplishing? How is it moving things forward or offering something that hasn't yet been offered? If not, maybe it doesn't belong. Okay, so in my final moments, here is what I recommend for getting non-writers, non-editors to look at your work successfully. So these are questions to ask of instead of, or questions to ask instead of, is this any good? I really recommend not asking that question for two reasons. One, it's really hard for your friends and family to be honest about that. And two, it's actually not that helpful, right? Because it's just someone's opinion. And, if they say it's great, or if they say, no, it's terrible, neither of those things really give you somewhere to go next. So instead, we want to ask questions that are kind of judgment-free as possible, as well as most likely to give us something that we can use. And so here are the questions that I recommend. Where did you find yourself most interested or invested in the book or story? Where did you find yourself feeling bored or putting it down? What were the places that confused you? And how would you describe X and Y character? So the first three questions is really about getting this information that we can use, right? It's a way of figuring out what's working and what's not working. And importantly, I recommend not asking, like, did you find yourself bored anywhere? Or did you find yourself confused anywhere? Because then the temptation for your loved one particularly is going to say, oh no, right? So frame the question in a way that acknowledges that in every piece of work, there are going to be places that are boring and places that are confusing, and then that's okay. We just want to know that as writers, so we can address it. And similarly, if we've asked that first question, we can see, what did I do in that part that was really working for folks? How can I bring it to this other part? And then this last question, I think it's just really can be really interesting and fruitful to know how people are reading your characters, how they're making sense of them. Maybe it'll be exactly what you want, and that's great to know that that's coming across. Maybe it will be not what you wanted or expected, but actually you're kind of delighted and it takes it in a new direction. Or maybe it gives you information like, hey, I need to kind of revisit this character or how I'm presenting them, because it's not coming across the way I wanted it to. All right, so final note is like the ultimate caveat. This is from Kurt Vonnegut talking about Flannery O'Connor. He made a list of rules in the preface to one of his short story collections for creative writing. And then he said of Flannery O'Connor, she broke practically every one of my rules but the first. Great writers tend to do that. And this is just my invitation, an invitation from me to you to relate to what I put here in a way that makes sense to you, not to let it limit your creativity or hold you back. I don't have all the answers, and you're the own best expert of your work. All right, so we will move into questions and answers now.